In Chapter 5, Mrs. Dean skips ahead a little bit, and we find that Mr. Earnshaw has suddenly become weak and unable to do much but sit around. His confinement caused him to be irritable. Mrs. Dean said that he believed that because he favored Heathcliff, everyone else hated Heathcliff and wanted to harm him. He also thought everybody was really just humoring him in his partiality to Heathcliff because they didn't want to upset him. Mrs. Dean thinks that humoring actually encouraged Heathcliff's pride and bad temper. Hindley, of course, wasn't quite willing to humor his dad, and 2 or 3 times he tried to be mean to Heathcliff near his dad. The old man would swing his stick at Hindley, but he wasn't able to reach him, and this made him shake with rage. The curate convinced Mr. Earnshaw that he needed to send Hindley to college. Mrs. Dean said she hoped that this would bring peace to the house, but then there was Cathy and Joseph. Joseph kept worrying Mr. Earnshaw about his soul, and he took every opportunity to complain about the kids, most especially Cathy. Mrs. Dean said that Cathy was always getting into mischief, from the time she woke up to the time she went to bed. She was always moving, always making noise, and talking or singing. But then she was also very sweet and meant no harm. She was also too fond of Heathcliff, and it was a punishment for her to be kept from him. In Mr. Earnshaw's state, he had no patience for her behavior, which of course made her want to be more annoying. Mrs. Dean claimed that Cathy was happiest when they were all scolding her at once. She would defy them with sassy looks and words, mocking Joseph's religious curses, baiting Mrs. Dean, and doing whatever Mr. Earnshaw didn't want her to do. She said Mr. Earnshaw thought her insolence was real, but Mrs. Dean says she really didn't think they were. Mrs. Dean also said that Mr. Earnshaw didn't like that Cathy had more power over Heathcliff than he did. Man, Mrs. Dean paints a really nasty picture of Cathy, while at the same time painting kind of a rosy picture of herself. She tells the story of one October evening. Mr. Earnshaw was sitting by the fireside. Mrs. Dean was busy knitting, and Joseph was reading the Bible near the table. Cathy was sick, so she leaned her head against her father's knee, and Heathcliff was laying on the floor with his head on her lap. Mr. Earnshaw stroked her hair and asked Cathy why she couldn't be this gentle all the time. In spite of being sick, Cathy responded with, "Why cannot you always be a good man, father?" Then she immediately kissed his hand to lessen the insult and began to sing him to sleep. His fingers fell from hers as she began singing, and his head dropped where his chin sank into his chest. Seeing this, Mrs. Dean hushed her so that she wouldn't wake him, and they all sat there, quiet, for a half hour. When Joseph finished his chapter, he said he had to rouse Mr. Earnshaw for bed, but when he went over to Mr. Earnshaw, he found that he was gone. He tried to rush the kids to bed so they would have time to figure out how to tell the kids what had happened. But before she could be stopped, Cathy hugged her dad goodnight and found out for herself. Cathy and Heathcliff cried out a heartbreaking wail, followed by Mrs. Dean. Joseph questioned why they were crying, since he was in heaven now. Then he instructed Mrs. Dean to fetch the doctor and a parson. She didn't really understand what good that would do, but she did what she was instructed to do. The doctor came right away, but the parson said he would come in the morning. While Joseph talked to the doctor, Mrs. Dean went upstairs to console the children, but she found them comforting each other. She said they said the nicest things about heaven and their father. She said that with all of their innocent talk about heaven, she wished they were all there, safe together. Thanks so much for watching and listening. If you like this video or like what I do, be sure to subscribe for more videos.